Imagine you're sitting down for dinner. There's a perfectly cooked steak on your plate. You cut into it, take a bite, and everything feels completely normal. Humans eat meat. We've been doing it for an incredibly long time. But here's a strange question. Why does the meat on your plate usually come from an animal that eats plants? Why a cow? Why a chicken? Why a pig? Why not a lion? Why not a wolf? Why not a tiger? After all, they're all made of meat. And technically, humans can eat many carnivorous animals. People have eaten bears, sharks, alligators, and other predators in different parts of the world. So there isn't some biological rule saying, "Thou shalt not eat anything with sharp teeth." Yet across much of the world, eating a lion or a wolf sounds completely disgusting. And the weirdest part is that there may be several very practical reasons behind that reaction. Let's start with something incredibly simple: energy. Every animal has to get energy from somewhere. Plants capture energy from sunlight, herbivores eat the plants, and predators eat the herbivores. But energy doesn't magically transfer from one animal to another with perfect efficiency. Most of it is lost along the way as heat, movement, metabolism, and all the other things an animal has to do simply to stay alive. That's why ecosystems usually have far more plants than herbivores, and far more herbivores than apex predators. Think about a grassland. Thousands of plants might support hundreds of grazing animals. Those animals might support a much smaller number of predators. By the time you reach the top of the food chain, you're dealing with an extremely expensive lifestyle. A lion doesn't spend its day eating grass and waiting for calories to arrive. It has to hunt. It has to chase prey. It has to survive injuries. And when it finally makes a kill, a huge amount of that energy is spent simply keeping the lion alive. So imagine you're an ancient human trying to get dinner. You see a deer. Then, a little farther away, you see the wolf that has been hunting the deer. Which one would you rather chase? The wolf might technically contain calories, but getting those calories could involve fighting an animal with teeth, claws, speed, and absolutely no interest in becoming your dinner. The deer, on the other hand, is already carrying energy it obtained from plants. So from an ancient hunter's perspective, hunting prey instead of predators was often the better deal. More food, less danger, less effort. But that is only the beginning. Because there is another problem with eating animals that spend their lives eating other animals, and you can't see it. It's hiding inside the food chain. It's called biomagnification. Imagine a tiny amount of a pollutant enters an ecosystem. A small organism absorbs it. A fish eats hundreds of those organisms. A larger fish eats dozens of those fish. Then a predator eats that larger fish. The substance can become increasingly concentrated as you move up the food chain. This is one reason humans are advised to limit consumption of certain large predatory fish. Animals, such as tuna, can accumulate mercury because they eat other organisms and live long enough for contaminants to build up. And this creates an interesting problem. A predator isn't just one animal. It's the final container for everything that came before it. Every fish it ate, every animal they ate, every contaminant that entered that ecosystem. The higher an animal sits in the food web, the more opportunity there can be for certain persistent substances to accumulate. And that's one reason why the biggest predators aren't necessarily the best animals to turn into dinner. But there's an even older problem: parasites. Carnivores spend their lives consuming other animals, and some parasites are perfectly adapted to move from one animal host to another through meat. One particularly nasty example is trichinella, a parasite associated with certain wild and domestic animals. When people consume infected meat that hasn't been cooked properly, the parasite can enter the body and eventually reach muscle tissue. And suddenly, your dinner isn't just dinner anymore. It's a transportation system. This is one reason meat from certain wild predators, especially bears, requires particularly careful preparation. Bear meat has been associated with trichinellosis, and cooking it thoroughly is extremely important. So now we have three problems. The energy problem. Predators are expensive to hunt and sit high on the food chain. The contamination problem. Certain substances can become more concentrated in organisms higher in the food web. And the parasite problem. Eating another animal means potentially exposing yourself to organisms that evolved to live inside animals. But there's still something missing. Because even after understanding all of this, there's a question that is almost impossible to ignore. Why does the idea of eating a lion feel so wrong? You can describe a juicy steak to someone and they'll probably get hungry. Describe a juicy wolf steak and suddenly the room gets very quiet. Why? Part of the answer is culture. Humans learn what counts as food from the people around them. A cow can be dinner in one society and sacred in another. A horse can be considered normal food in one country and emotionally unacceptable in another. So culture clearly matters. But humans also have something else: disgust. Disgust is one of the strangest survival systems in the human body. Your brain doesn't wait for you to calculate every possible disease, parasite, or toxin before deciding whether something is safe. Sometimes it simply tells you. Humans do eat some carnivores. People eat shark. Some cultures eat crocodilians. Bear has been eaten by humans for centuries, and we eat plenty of predatory fish. So the rule isn't actually carnivores are poisonous. They're not. The real story is much more complicated. It depends on the species, its diet, its environment, its position in the food web, the parasites it carries, how long it lives, how it's prepared, and what the culture around it considers food. And there's another important factor. Predators are difficult to domesticate. Think about the animals humans turned into livestock: cows, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens. Many of them reproduce relatively quickly, eat food that humans can provide, tolerate living around other animals, and can be raised in large numbers. Now imagine trying to build a farm full of lions. You would need to feed your lions other animals. But where would those animals come from? You would need to raise prey animals to feed the predators so that you could eventually eat the predators. That's an incredibly inefficient system. Instead of feeding plants to a cow and eventually eating the cow, you'd be feeding animals to another animal and then eating that predator. You're adding another expensive step between sunlight and your dinner. And that is one of the biggest reasons human food systems ended up favoring herbivores and omnivores over apex predators. We didn't just choose the animals that tasted good. We chose animals that were practical, animals that could reproduce, animals that could be controlled, animals that could survive around humans, animals that could convert relatively cheap food into something humans could eat. And over thousands of years, that changed the entire relationship between humans and animals. We didn't domesticate lions. We domesticated cows. We didn't build enormous farms of wolves. We built enormous farms of chickens. And eventually, the animals we raised became so normal that we stopped thinking about the strange biological decision hiding behind our dinner plates. So the next time you look at a hamburger, chicken sandwich, or steak, think about what you're actually looking at. You're not just looking at meat. You're looking at the result of a gigantic evolutionary and ecological calculation. Plants capture energy from the sun. Herbivores turn that energy into animal tissue. Humans eat the herbivores. And predators sit farther up the chain, where energy becomes more expensive. Certain contaminants can accumulate. Parasite risks can increase, and hunting becomes much more dangerous. That's why the animal on your plate is usually not the animal chasing the animal on your plate. And perhaps the strangest part is this: humans didn't need to understand the food chain to figure it out. Our ancestors didn't know about trophic levels. They didn't know about biomagnification. They didn't know about parasites hiding inside muscle. They simply learned, generation after generation, which animals were worth hunting, which animals were worth raising, and which animals were better left alone. So maybe the question isn't really, why don't we eat carnivores? Maybe the better question is, how did humans become so good at knowing what not to eat? Because hidden behind almost every meal you eat today is a survival decision made thousands of years before anyone knew the science behind it. And that means your dinner isn't just food, it's evolution on a plate. If you enjoyed this kind of strange human mystery, subscribe for more stories about the hidden reasons behind things we see every day. And comment below, would you eat lion or wolf meat if someone offered?